My parents hid my $3 million trust. Revenge exposed their family lies and reclaimed my life. It was New Year's Eve, and just as the clock ticked closer to midnight, the front door swung open, and my Uncle Richard stepped inside without warning. He had not called, had not texted, had not visited in years, but there he was, in a pressed suit, his eyes sharp and restless. He looked around the room once, then locked his gaze on me. "Jacob," he said firmly, "how's that $3 million trust fund I set up for you 6 years ago?" I froze and placed my fork halfway to my mouth. The laughter around the table died instantly. My heart slammed against my ribs as I struggled to form words. Finally, I choked out the only response I had. "What trust fund? I've been working 3 jobs just to survive. I don't have a trust fund." The color drained from the room. My uncle's face hardened, his jaw tightening as his eyes flicked toward my parents. I followed his stare, and in that moment, I saw something I had never seen before. My mother's face turned pale, and her hands trembled against the edge of the table. My father's shoulders stiffened as he stared down at his plate, refusing to meet anyone's eyes. Uncle Richard's voice rose thick with fury. "Don't tell me you never gave it to him. That money was his right. That money was his future." My parents did not answer. Their silence filled the room with a heavier weight than words ever could. I sat there in disbelief, my mind racing with questions I had no power to stop. Why had I never heard of this? Why had I been breaking myself to survive if a fortune was meant for me all along? And why were my parents looking like the walls had finally collapsed around them? That was when Richard turned back to me, his face burning with anger, and he said something that shattered everything I thought I knew about my life. "My name is Jacob Miller. I am 26 years old, and for most of my life I believed I came from a working-class family that struggled to keep its head above water. I grew up thinking hard work was the only way to earn respect, and that survival came from grit, not privilege. That belief shaped me, hardened me, and often left me questioning whether my life would ever be more than a string of exhausting shifts and unpaid bills. At the time my uncle walked in, I was living through the hardest season of my life. I was juggling 3 jobs, each one grinding me down in a different way. By day, I stood behind the counter of a convenience store, forcing a smile as customers rushed through with their coffee and cigarettes. When I clocked out, I switched into the uniform of a delivery driver, criss-crossing Chicago in an old car that rattled louder than the radio. Some nights, when I could barely keep my eyes open, I dragged myself into handyman work, patching drywall or unclogging sinks in apartments that smelled of mildew. I did it all because I had no choice. Rent never waited. Groceries always came with another receipt I could barely pay. Even a simple doctor's visit was something I put off, convincing myself I could live with the pain in my back or the pounding in my temples. My life was a cycle of fatigue. Still, I tried to hold on to hope. I kept telling myself that someday all this effort would mean something, that maybe I would find a way to break free. My parents never talked much about money. My mother, Margaret, always insisted we were fine, even when I knew the refrigerator was half empty or when the power company's final notice slipped under our front door. She told me that every hardship was a lesson. "Hard work builds character," she said again and again. She meant well, and I believed her because she was the one person who never stopped believing in me. My father, Thomas, was the opposite. He was a man of few words, and when he did speak, it was often about responsibility and toughness. "Focus on getting through the week," he would mutter when I complained about being tired. He worked long hours in construction, his hands rough and scarred from years of labor, but he rarely shared more than the basics of his day. I used to wonder if he even noticed how hard I was working, or if he thought it was just the way life was supposed to be. Despite the constant grind, I tried to keep the peace at home. My parents were all I had, and even when I was frustrated, I convinced myself that someday I would make them proud. That belief carried me through nights when my body wanted to give up. I thought we were a team facing the world together. I had no idea that under the surface there were secrets none of them dared to tell me. New Year's Eve should have been a celebration. That night we sat around a small wooden table in our living room, wearing the flimsy paper hats my mom had bought at the discount store. She had cooked a modest dinner of roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, and green beans, stretching every dollar as she always did. A bottle of cheap champagne sat unopened on the counter, waiting for midnight. I looked at the clock and then at my phone. My friends were posting pictures of glittering parties downtown Chicago, the kind with open bars, sparkling dresses, and confetti showers. I felt a sting of envy, but quickly pushed it aside. This was my family, and though it was simple, I told myself it was enough. As I sat there, I studied my parents. My mother smiled, trying to keep the mood light, but her eyes gave away a heaviness that had been growing for years. My father was quiet as usual, carving his chicken with slow, deliberate movements. I wondered if he even noticed how different our lives were from those of the people around us, or if he had accepted that this was simply our place in the world. I remember raising my glass of soda and saying, "Here's to a better year. Maybe this one will finally turn things around." My mother smiled faintly and clinked her glass against mine. My father nodded but said nothing. For a moment I felt the sting of silence, the kind that reminds you how much you want to be heard but never are. I pushed the feeling down and reminded myself to be grateful. At least I had them. At least I wasn't spending the night alone. At least there was food on the table, however modest. That was the story I told myself. The story that kept me from resenting the long hours and the constant struggle. But as I sat there watching the seconds tick closer to midnight, I could not have imagined that everything I believed about my family was about to collapse. I thought the year ahead might bring better luck, maybe even a chance at stability. Instead, it brought a revelation so powerful that it tore apart every assumption I had built my life on. When the knock came at the door and my Uncle Richard stepped inside, my world shifted forever. The sound of the front door opening on New Year's Eve startled all of us. We were not expecting anyone. I turned in my chair and saw a tall figure step inside without hesitation, as if he owned the place. My breath caught when I realized it was my Uncle Richard. I had not seen him in years. He was my father's older brother, though I had never felt close to him. Where my father looked worn down by years of labor, Richard always carried himself with a sharpness that made people uneasy. He wore a tailored suit, even though it was a holiday night, and his silver hair was combed neatly back. His presence filled the small living room, instantly pushing out whatever warmth we had managed to hold on to during dinner. "Happy New Year," he said flatly, his voice carrying both authority and judgment. His eyes scanned the room before settling on me. Then, without a smile, without any small talk, he leaned slightly forward and spoke the words that stopped my world. "So, Jacob, how's that $3 million trust fund treating you?" I blinked, certain I had misheard him. My fork clattered against my plate. The room went silent, so quiet I could hear the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. My mouth went dry, but somehow I forced words out. "What trust fund? I've been working 3 jobs just to get by. I don't have a trust fund." For a moment Richard's face did not move, as if he was measuring my sincerity. Then his jaw tightened, his eyes narrowed, and a flash of anger sparked in his expression. He turned his head toward my parents, and in that single movement, the atmosphere in the room changed from confusion to something darker. "What is this?" he demanded, his voice rising with controlled fury. "You mean to tell me you never told him? You kept everything from him?" My mother froze, her hands trembling against the tablecloth. Her face turned pale and she looked down at her plate as though the mashed potatoes could shield her from the storm. My father did not lift his eyes at all. He carved his chicken slowly, mechanically, refusing to acknowledge the words that had just been spoken. I looked at them both, my heart hammering. "Mom, Dad, what is he talking about?" Neither of them answered. My mother opened her mouth as if to speak, but then shut it again, shaking her head slightly. My father cleared his throat, but no words came. Richard's voice cut through the silence like a blade. 6 years ago I set up a trust fund for Jacob, $3 million. It was his inheritance, his future. And you mean to tell me you let him break his back for scraps while you hid it from him? I stared at my parents in disbelief. Is this true? You knew about this. You knew and you said nothing while I worked nights and slept in my car between shifts? My mother whispered, "Jacob, please." But her voice broke and faded away. My father still refused to look at me. His silence was louder than any words. Anger surged in my chest, flooding through me in a way I had never felt before. I slammed my hands against the table. "Answer me! Is it true?" Finally, my father lifted his eyes, but only to glare at his brother. "This isn't your business, Richard." "Not my business?" Richard roared. "This is my nephew's life. This is his birthright, and you've buried it under your lies." The tension in the room grew unbearable. I could barely breathe. Questions rattled in my head faster than I could process them. Why had I never been told? What were they hiding? What could possibly justify letting me suffer when there was money meant to give me a future? I turned to my mother, desperate for the truth. Why? Why didn't you ever tell me?" Tears welled in her eyes. She reached across the table toward my hand, but I pulled back. Her voice cracked as she whispered, "We thought it was better this way." "Better?" I shouted. "You thought it was better for me to think I had nothing? To believe I had to fight every single day just to survive while you hid a fortune that was mine?" My Uncle Richard slammed his fist against the table, rattling the dishes. "Enough. He deserves to know everything. You cannot keep hiding this, not anymore." My father's face hardened. His lips pressed into a thin line and his eyes darkened with anger. For the first time in my life, I saw fear in his expression, too. He had always been a quiet man, but now he looked cornered. I could feel the air in the room thick with unspoken words. My Uncle Richard's fury, my mother's guilt, my father's silence. It all built into a storm that was about to break. I knew deep down that whatever secret they had kept from me was bigger than just money. There was something else, something hidden behind years of silence and half-truths. I pushed back my chair, standing up so quickly it nearly toppled over. "I'm not a child anymore. Stop protecting me. Stop lying to me. Tell me the truth." My voice shook with rage and desperation. My chest rose and fell as if I had run a marathon. But I would not back down. I had spent my life staying quiet, working hard, accepting scraps while believing that was my destiny. Not anymore. My Uncle Richard rose to his feet as well, towering over the table, his voice thunderous. "He's right. He's old enough, and you cannot keep him in the dark any longer. The truth will come out tonight." My parents sat frozen, pale and trembling. For a moment, the only sound was the ticking clock on the wall, each second stretching into eternity. I knew something irreversible was about to be revealed, something that would tear apart the only life I had ever known. The air in the room felt suffocating. My Uncle Richard's words still echoed like a hammer striking steel, and my parents sat in silence, trembling under the weight of his accusations. I stood at the edge of the table, fists clenched, heart racing, my voice raw from demanding the truth. I could no longer sit still. For years I had obeyed their lessons, believing every word they told me about hard work, sacrifice, and humility. I had convinced myself that my exhaustion was noble, that the blisters on my hands and the bags under my eyes were proof I was building character. Yet here I stood, suddenly confronted with evidence that my entire life had been built on deception. The people I trusted most had kept me in the dark. I took a step toward them. "I want answers, not later, not tomorrow, right now. You let me break myself for years while you watched. You owe me the truth." My mother shook her head as tears rolled down her cheeks. "Jacob, please," she whispered, her voice trembling. "This is not the way you should find out." "Find out what?" I shouted. "That my life could have been different? That I didn't have to sleep in my car between shifts? That I didn't have to eat ramen every night while a fortune was sitting somewhere with my name on it? What else have you been keeping from me?" My father finally looked up at me. His eyes were cold, his jaw stiff. "You are my son. That is what matters. I gave you a roof. I gave you food. I taught you what it means to fight for survival." I felt anger boil in my chest. "You gave me silence. You gave me lies. That's what you gave me." Richard stepped closer to me, his hand firm on my shoulder. "You are right to demand answers. You have been treated unfairly. I will not stand by while they keep burying the truth." My father glared at him. "Stay out of this, Richard. You've meddled enough. This is our family, not yours." But Richard refused to back down. "He is David Miller's son, not yours, Thomas, and you know it." The words hit me like a punch. I steadied myself, refusing to let them keep control of my life any longer. My mother gasped, covering her mouth with her hands, as if Richard had ripped away the last layer of protection she had tried to build around me. I turned back to her. "Is that true? Is that what this is about? Tell me who I am. Tell me who my father is." She reached for me again, her voice cracking with desperation. "Jacob, please listen. We were only trying to protect you. We wanted you to have a normal life. We thought if we kept it from you, you would be safe." "Safe from what?" I demanded. My voice shook, but it carried more force than I had ever felt. "Safe from knowing the truth? Safe from my own life? You say you wanted me to be normal, but nothing about this is normal. You watched me fall apart while you kept secrets that could have changed everything. That is not protection, that is betrayal." For the first time in my life, I saw my mother collapse under the weight of her own guilt. She buried her face in her hands and sobbed. My father sat stiff and silent, refusing to give me the answers I needed, his pride keeping him chained to his lies. I straightened my back and drew in a deep breath. My voice lowered but grew sharper, steadier. You don't get to decide what I know anymore. You don't get to keep me in the dark. Tonight I want the truth, all of it. No more excuses." Richard nodded firmly beside me. "He is right. You had your chance to explain. Now he deserves to hear what has been hidden for far too long." My father slammed his hand against the table, rattling the dishes. "You think you know what is best for him, Richard? But you don't. You never did. You come in here with your money and your lectures, acting like you care. But where were you all these years?" "I was honoring David Miller's wishes," Richard snapped. "I gave him a future that you stole. You took his legacy and buried it. And for what? To keep control? To hide your shame?" Their voices rose, clashing like thunder. But I no longer felt like a bystander. I no longer felt like the quiet son who nodded and obeyed. This was my life they were arguing over. They had stolen it. And I would not be silenced. I slammed my fist down harder than both of them, the sound cutting through their shouting. "Enough! You can argue about who is right or wrong, but this is my life. I am the one who lived it, not you. So I am telling you now, I will not leave this room until I know everything." The room fell silent again. My mother's sobs slowed into quiet gasps. My father's chest heaved with anger, but he said nothing. Richard stared at me with approval, as if he saw a strength in me that had been buried under years of silence and obedience. I stood there, unshaken. For the first time in my life, I felt in control. My words carried weight. My demand for the truth could no longer be ignored. I had made my choice. I would face whatever came next, no matter how painful it was. Richard's eyes locked on mine. "Then you should hear it from me. Tonight you will finally know who you are." My pulse quickened. Every nerve in my body braced for the truth that was about to change my life forever. The room felt frozen in time, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. My demand for the truth had shattered the silence, and now there was no turning back. My Uncle Richard stood tall beside me, his eyes locked on my parents. My mother wept quietly into her hands, and my father sat rigid, his face pale yet defiant. I could feel the tension crackling in the air like electricity before a storm. Richard's voice broke the stillness, steady and sharp. "Jacob deserves the truth. He has lived his whole life carrying a weight that was never his to bear. Tonight he learns who he really is." My chest tightened. I gripped the back of my chair to steady myself, bracing for words that I knew would change me forever. My mother's shoulders shook and she whispered through her tears, "Please, Richard, don't." He ignored her plea. His eyes never left mine. "Jacob, Thomas is not your biological father." The words struck with the force of a hammer. My knees weakened, and for a moment I thought I might collapse. Every memory of my childhood, every lesson, every stern glance, every struggle, suddenly twisted into something unfamiliar. I turned to my father, or the man I thought was my father, searching his face for denial, for anger, for anything to suggest this wasn't real. But Thomas sat stone still, refusing to argue. His silence confirmed everything. I stumbled backward, shaking my head. You're saying the man who raised me isn't my father." Richard stepped closer, his voice firm. "Your real father was my brother, David Miller. He was a good man, Jacob. He loved you before you were even born. He wanted to give you everything he never had." My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears. The name sounded distant and familiar all at once, like a shadow I had always known but never understood. "David," I whispered. "Why have I never heard about him?" My mother finally lifted her face, her eyes red and swollen. Her voice shook as she tried to explain. "Because David Miller died before you were old enough to know him. He was your father, Jacob. He was the love of my life. But after his accident, I married Thomas because he promised to raise you as his own. I thought it was the best way to give you a stable family." I staggered back as the truth unraveled. My chest burned with betrayal. "You lied to me my entire life. You made me believe Thomas was my father while you hid the truth about the man who actually was." My father's voice finally cut through, deep and unyielding. "I raised you, Jacob. Blood doesn't change that. I put food on the table. I gave you discipline. I kept you alive." I snapped, my voice raw with anger. "You kept me alive, but you also kept me blind. You let me believe a false story about myself while I struggled every day. And all the while there was a trust fund waiting for me, money my real father left me. You let me suffer while you buried his legacy." My Uncle Richard's face burned with fury as he pointed directly at Thomas. "You robbed him of his inheritance. That money was meant to give him a life David dreamed for him. You let him scrape and bleed for years while you sat in silence." Thomas's face hardened, but his eyes flickered with guilt. He needed to learn the value of hard work. Money makes people soft. I wasn't going to raise a spoiled boy. Hard work, I shouted. My voice cracked, but I didn't care. I've worked myself into the ground. I've lost sleep. I've skipped meals. I've missed out on life because I thought I had no choice, and all this time you let me break myself down while you kept his gift locked away. That wasn't teaching me a lesson, that was cruelty. My mother reached for me, tears spilling down her cheeks. We thought we were protecting you from disappointment. We thought if you grew up without knowing about the money you would learn strength. We thought it was the only way. I pulled away, my throat raw. Protecting me? You didn't protect me. You stole from me. You stole my chance to know who I really was. You stole my right to know my father. Richard's voice softened, though his anger still burned. David Miller loved you, Jacob. He told me to make sure you had everything you needed. That trust fund was his promise to you. He wanted you to grow into the man he knew you could be, and I will not let that promise be buried any longer. I looked at Thomas, the man who had raised me, the man I had called father all my life. Why? Why would you do this to me? Was it jealousy? Was it control? Did you ever even love me? His face twisted with pain, but his words were steady. I raised you as my own. That was love, Jacob. Maybe I made mistakes, but everything I did to keep you strong. I shook my head, tears stinging my eyes. You kept me strong by breaking me. You kept me blind so you could play the role you wanted. You never gave me a choice. The truth stood in the air between us, heavy and undeniable. My real father was gone. My inheritance had been hidden. The man I trusted most had built my life on lies. I felt like the floor had disappeared beneath me, leaving nothing but free fall. Yet in that moment I also felt something else, resolve. The truth was mine now. No more silence. No more secrets. I was no longer the obedient son who accepted hardship without question. I was David Miller's son, and his legacy would no longer be denied. As fireworks exploded outside, rattling the windows with bursts of light, I stood taller. My life had just been torn apart, but I knew this was the night it would finally begin. The fireworks outside roared through the night sky, but inside that small living room the celebration felt hollow. My life had just been broken open. I stood in the same house I had always known, surrounded by the same people I had always called family, yet nothing felt familiar anymore. My hands trembled as the truth settled deeper into my chest. David Miller was my father. He had left me a future, and the people who should have loved me enough to tell me had chosen silence instead. I sat down heavily in the chair I had pushed away minutes before. My legs felt weak, my chest tight. My mother reached for me again, but I pulled back. I wasn't ready for comfort. Not from her, not when her silence had cost me so much. She lowered her hands slowly, tears spilling freely down her face. Thomas sat across from me. He was not crying, he rarely showed emotion. But tonight there was something in his eyes I had never seen before. Guilt, yes, but also fear. He knew he no longer had the same hold over me. His authority, his silence, his lessons built on hardship. They all meant less now that I knew the truth. Uncle Richard stood tall beside me, almost like a guardian, though I wasn't sure I was ready to trust him either. He had kept this secret for years as well, even if he claimed it wasn't his place to reveal it sooner. Still, in that moment he was the only one who had spoken with honesty. The only one who looked me in the eyes and refused to let me live in the dark any longer. I finally found my voice, though it came out low and heavy. All those nights I thought I was nothing. All those mornings I woke up wondering if I would ever escape this life. You knew I had a chance. You knew I had a father who wanted me to be secure, and you took that away from me. My mother sobbed harder. We thought it was the best way. We thought if you grew up without relying on money you would be strong. We thought you would be safe from disappointment. I shook my head. Safe? I was never safe. I was exhausted. I was hungry. I was desperate. That wasn't protection. That was cruelty disguised as love. Thomas finally spoke, his voice sharp but strained. You needed to learn the value of survival. You would have wasted that money. You would have turned soft. The anger rose in me again, but I kept my voice steady. You never gave me the chance to prove who I was. You never let me choose. You decided for me, and that is not love. That is control. The room went quiet again. My mother's cries faded into quiet sniffles. Thomas stared at the floor. Richard kept his hand firm on the back of my chair. I thought about David Miller, the man I never got to know. I imagined him picturing me, his son, and deciding to build a future for me. I imagined him working, saving, and trusting that the people around me would honor his wishes. He had loved me enough to plan for a life he would never see me live, and yet all of that had been hidden, stolen by silence. As the reality sank deeper, I realized something important. Money alone would not heal this wound. The trust fund might change my circumstances, but it would not erase the years of struggle, the nights of loneliness, the betrayal that had shaped my identity. What mattered more than the money was the truth. The truth gave me a choice. The truth gave me freedom. I stood again, this time taller, steadier. My voice carried a calm I hadn't felt before. I cannot change the years I lost. I cannot change what you chose to hide, but I can choose what happens now. From this night on, no one decides for me. I will know my father's story. I will claim the life he wanted me to have, and I will live it with the strength I built in the shadows you forced me into. My mother sobbed into her hands, whispering, "I'm sorry," again and again. Thomas said nothing. He sat there like a man defeated, stripped of the role he had clung to for decades. Richard nodded slowly, pride flickering in his eyes. I walked outside into the cold air. The fireworks were still bursting across the sky, painting it in gold and red. Neighbors cheered in the distance, their voices carried on the winter wind. For them, this was a night of celebration. For me, it was something else entirely. It was the night I stopped being blind. It was the night I learned who I really was. I looked up at the sky and thought of David Miller. I didn't know his voice. I didn't know the sound of his laugh or the way he carried himself. But I knew he loved me. I knew he believed in me enough to fight for my future, even when he would never be there to see it. That knowledge alone filled me with a strength I had never felt before. I turned back to the house, knowing the relationships inside would never be the same. The lies had destroyed the foundation we once stood on. But I also knew something else. The truth had set me free. I would not carry their silence any longer. As the new year began, I made a promise to myself. I would not waste the life my father wanted for me. I would not bury the truth again, and I would never allow lies to define me. I faced the camera in my mind, as if speaking to anyone willing to hear me. Family is not about hiding secrets. Family is not about control. Family is about honesty. If you are keeping the truth from someone you love, believing it protects them, you are wrong. The truth might hurt, but lies will destroy. And I refuse to let lies define me anymore. The sky thundered again with fireworks. And for the first time in years, I felt a sense of beginning. My life had been broken open, but in that brokenness I had found something more powerful than money or security. I had found myself. That night changed everything for me. I walked into the new year no longer the same person. I carried anger, yes, but also clarity. The truth gave me the chance to start over, to reclaim the life that was meant for me, and to finally step out from the shadows of lies.